I made an earlier version of this video, but I left out a section on how to install the outer bearing races, so that's included in this new version. I'm going to replace the steering head bearings in this 1983 R100RS. And this is the steering head in the frame. So there's a bearing that goes up here, tapered roller bearing, and then another one that goes down here. They're the same size bearings. I'm going to have the frame powder coated, so I'm going to remove the outer bearing race. Now, the outer bearing race can get damaged over time, and that's done by the inner race, the tapered rollers, and they pound into the outer race. And what will happen is that eventually they will harden lines in the outer race, and you can see some vertical dark lines along the inside of this outer race. Those are called brinelling. And what's happening is that roller keeps smashing into the outer race and eventually hardens it, and also causes a detent or a depression. What that feels like is the handlebars will be notchy when you turn them. Now that can also be caused by old steering head bearing grease that's gotten really hard. But if you service those bearings and replace the grease and you still have notchiness, well, then you've got damaged bearing races. Anyway, I'm going to pull these out because I need to powder coat the frame, and then I'll be putting in a new set. This is the steering head outer race puller tool that I got from CycleWorks, and it's what I use to remove the races. Comes with a hardened special bolt that has a tapered face here, and then a ring that has a slot cut in it so that it can expand, and a very sharp edge at the bottom. So that fits like this, and when it's pressed against the head of the bolt, it'll open up and the sharp edge will fit underneath the bottom of the outer race, so that you can get under it to help extract it. There's a sleeve that goes down and presses on here, and then a very large nut, which is the way you get all the force onto the slotted washer at the bottom. So then this sleeve fits on the top of the steering head and has a special washer with a nut, and that fits into the top like that. So then the puller mechanism threads into the nut, and as you tighten everything up, it pulls the puller mechanism up out of the steering head, pulling the outer bearing race along with it. So it's a very clever tool and usually does a nice job. So this is the puller mechanism that I've assembled, and I put it in, and I'll probably have to tap it to get it to seat. And you see right here it's under that bearing now. Now I need to tighten the nut down, take the slack out, and then use a couple of crescent wrenches to expand that split ring. And I want that to be pretty tight. So lean into it a little bit. There we go. That seems pretty tight. Now the sleeve goes in, and there's two ends to the sleeve. One end will fit over the outside of the steering head, but the other just sits on top. So you want the side that'll fit over so that it'll act as a pulling surface. And then this is the side that fits with the little cover here with the nut built into the top. There we are. So we got everything tightened. And now it's a question of pulling it up out of the steering head. There it goes. I think that moved. Yeah, it's beginning to come up and out. Yeah, I can hear it. Okay, it's come loose, and I just pull the cover out, and there's the bearing outer race. And to get that off, I just disassemble everything. But this is the inside of the steering head, and that's where the outer race fits in. So all I have to do is do this one more time on the bottom, and I'll have both of the races out of the steering head. So now that I have it taken apart, this is the outer race, and that's how that all fits right inside the steering head. So I'm going to remove the inner steering head bearing race that fits on the bottom of the steering stem, and there's a dust cover at the bottom, and I'm going to pull them up off of the steering stem. To do that, I use a CycleWorks tool designed to do the job. This particular part will slide down through the base underneath the bearing, and then the puller part sits on the top, and as I tighten the nut, it'll pull the whole bearing race up the stem. So that's the easy way to get the bearing off. So I'm going to start by getting the puller base underneath the dust cap. So it's between the dust cap and the base of the triple clamp. And I usually find that I need to kind of give it some persuasion. There we go. So it's slid all the way even with the back of the bearing. And then the puller just slides down like that, and then there's two nuts to secure it. So that's all you need to do to assemble the puller. Now I'm just going to use a socket and tighten up the nut and pull the bearing. Now what will happen is it'll come loose because there's a taper on the steering stem. So I've got it off the bottom where it was captive on the stem. And then what I'm going to do is pull it on up, and there'll be another tight spot that I'll need to use the puller to pull it up and over. So I'll have to adjust the nuts and make them come down further, and then I can get the rest of it out. So I've reset the tool. I backed this nut all the way up so I'll have room to pull the bearing up over this wide spot in the stem, and I've reset the nuts. So just continue tightening everything up, and it should pull the bearing up off that wide spot on the end of the steering stem. Now I've run out of room and I'm still not quite off, so what I'll do is reset this and drop it, and that'll give me a little more room to pull it. So I've got it reset with the nut higher and the bar down lower, and this should be sufficient to get it all to come off. Yeah, it's getting loose now. There we go. So the bearing just slides right up and off, and I can get the bearing out of the tool. Now, the reason there's a wide spot up here is that there's an upper steering stem bearing, so this is to capture the lower race, just like at the bottom. So that's why you end up with it being hard and then real easy, and then you have to pull it through the second wide spot. And this is the new grease cup or dust cap that'll go on the bottom. And if I need it, I have a tube that I can slide down the steering stem that'll be able to knock the bearing all the way down the stem with a hammer. But what I've done is freeze the stem and heat the bearing, and there's a real good chance the bearing will just slide right down the stem. So I have the frozen steering stem, and I've slidden the little dust cap down, and then the bearing should hopefully just slide right down, just like that. So that's the quick and easy way to install that inner race. So I'm getting ready to install the new steering head bearings. There's two of them. They're both tapered roller bearings. So there's the inner race and the outer race. Now the first step is to install the outer race into the steering head. And to do that, I'm going to use the CycleWorks tools with a couple of other parts that were the pieces I used to extract the inner race. But this is the puller bolt that I used to extract it, but now I'm going to put a flat washer on it and a coupling nut and then a piece of threaded rod into the coupling nut, and then I'm going to be able to slide the new outer race over it, and then the cap nut here will go on like that, and it'll push the race down into the hole in the steering stem. So it's a simple draw bar tool to drive the race in. So this is the steering stem, and this is where the top inner race is going to go. I put a little engine oil in just to lubricate that surface, make it a little easier to draw the race into the hole. So to tighten up the drawbar, there's an Allen head on the face of the bolt at the bottom, but it's an SAE 3/8, so your metrics aren't going to fit that. And it'll slide up like this, and then I can put that on the bottom to hold that from spinning. And then on the top, the outer race and this cover will go down, and I'll just use a big socket wrench to take that down and pull the outer race into the hole. Now to get started, I put the new race into the top, and then I tapped it to get it to be even all the way around and sort of snug, but just tried to get it set flush. So I've got the drawbar installed now, and the top cover here is on top of the bearing, so I'll just tighten everything up and draw it in. Now it's going sideways. So to straighten out the race, I just used my plastic mallet and tapped around the high spot to get it flush, and then I'll put the tool in to finish drawing it all the way down. So the top race is installed now, and I just used the tool to put the bottom one in, I sort of inverted the tool, and so my bottom race is installed as well. So I'm ready to put the steering stem in. So the next step is to pack the bearings with grease, and I like to use this red extreme pressure grease. So I pack the lower bearing and also the upper bearing, and then I can slide the steering stem inside the steering head and put the upper bearing on, and that whole thing is secured by a special nut. It has notches in it to fit the tool that's used to tighten this nut up to increase the preload, but it's also special in another way. One face is a flat face, but the other face has a taper and a smaller flat face on it. And frequently people install this backwards and they have the tapered small face pointing up. In fact, it should be installed with a flat face pointing up. And the reason for that is that this is the inner race in the top bearing, and the small tapered face fits right on top of the inner race. So as you tighten it, it increases the preload on the bearing correctly. So that's why you always install this with the flat face pointing up. I'm also putting grease on the outer race face on the top and the bottom, as I want to make sure I have a fair amount of grease in the rollers and on that face so that they are really well lubricated. So I've packed the lower bearing and I've rotated it a number of times and repacked it. So I've got grease very, very thickly laid inside, and I'm not too worried about getting it all over the lower clamp. I'll clean that up later. But it slides up now like that. And then I did the same thing to the upper bearing. It's really coated. And I'm just going to slide that down over the top like that. There we go. And then I just grab my nut and make sure the tapered face is down, and screw that down here, and then I'll use it to push the upper bearing down and into the lower race. So I'll get the tool and just keep tightening it, and then that'll compress the two inner races onto the outer races. So this is the tool kit's hook spanner for tightening up that nut on the steering head, and I'll just use it to tighten up the nut and compress the bearings into the races. I'll set everything to the proper torque settings when I get the handlebars ready to install, but right now I just want to get everything kind of where it needs to be and rotate the bearings and get the grease nicely distributed. So now that I've used the top nut to compress the bearings and to seat the upper inner race on the steering stem, I'm going to take it off to show you how all the parts go together. There's a chrome dust cap which will fit over like this, and then the special nut goes on top of that. Then the next part that goes on is the top triple clamp or top plate that'll fit over the steering stem, and it's held in place by the acorn nut, and that threads on top of the steering stem. The stock BMW top plate is made out of thin, flimsy steel, and I don't like it. So I'm going to actually replace this with the toaster tan top brace when I get that far in the project. And I'm also going to replace the acorn nut with toaster tan's version, because this land right here is really thin and his is thicker, so there's much more bearing area between it and the top plate. So that just helps keep everything nice and secure.